Welcome and thank you for coming to the Library of Congress this afternoon. And our special thanks to the Embassy of Mongolia, the Mongolian Cultural Center, and Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History for bringing the participants in the 18th Annual Mongolian Studies Conference to the library again for this year's keynote talk. I'm Susan Meinheit, Tibetan and Mongolian specialist in the library's Asian division. And it's my pleasure to introduce K.G. Chu, Chief of the Asian Division, for a brief welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Library of Congress this afternoon and to the 18th Mongolian Studies Conference, a keynote speech. The Asian Division is delighted to host this program, and we extend our thanks to our colleagues across the library and our friends at the Embassy and the Cultural Center. The Asian collection holds over 4 million physical items in approximately 200 languages and dialects from across Asia. These rich resources are available to users in the Asian Reading Room located just across the Great Hall in the Jefferson Building. Our librarians and specialists with expertise in both language and subject areas provide reference and in-depth consultations as well as research orientations to groups of researchers. In addition to print materials and other materials in micro format, the Asian Reading Room is where users can access our databases and electronic resources. And additionally, our digitized collections, web archives, open access materials, and research guides are freely available to users across the world. And our Mongolian collection is one of the largest in North America and currently hosts nearly 20,000 books and serials issues, as well as materials in other formats. And our Mongolian and Tibetan reference specialist, Susan Meinheit, whom you've just met, has prepared a small display from the collections in the Asian Reading Room for you to browse after this talk. We invite you to make use of our collections, whether for research purposes or a journey to Buddhist teachings, or hunting for public domain images, or even to search for some cookbook. I believe we have something for everyone, and I promise you will never be disappointed. So just come to our reading room or visit our website. And with that, I will hand back to Susan, who will introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Atwood. And we look forward to hearing his insights into the Mongolian history and how language, translation, verse, and text all play a part in that. Thank you.
Our keynote speaker today is Christopher P. Atwood. Christopher P. Atwood is Presidential Distinguished Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania, where his research focuses on Mongolian and Chinese frontier and ethnic history. He is a recipient of the Order of the Polar Star, awarded by the President of Mongolia, and Onan Prize, awarded by the University of Cambridge, Mongolia and Inner Asian Studies Unit. Professor Atwood received his A.B. from Harvard University and his Ph.D. from Indiana University, Bloomington, in the Central Eurasian Studies Department. In addition, he holds honorary doctorates from the Mongolian Academy of Sciences and the National University of Mongolia. In 2023, he published a new translation of The Secret History of the Mongols. His new book, Translation and Commentary on the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, is being published by Britwell Press. We are honored today to have him present The Secret History of the Mongols' Little Brother, The Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, its tangled fate, and its significance. Please welcome Professor Atwood.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you also, Kay. And I also want to give a big thank you to Sarol and to the Mongolian Cultural Center, and of course to the Mongolian Embassy. This Mongolian Cultural Conference has become really one of my favorite things to attend. I love it being here, and I especially love being in the Library of Congress, which, as I often say, I've said this before and I'll say it again, it is my favorite building in all of the United States. It is beautiful and it is for a noble purpose. So it's a really wonderful thing to be here, and I really am deeply honored by being given this opportunity. So I would like to, so everybody knows the secret history of the Mongols, or at least everybody in Mongolian studies knows that. If I may ask, can I have a show of hands of those who have read The Secret History of the Mongols in some form or another? Mongolian, English, modern Mongolian, paraphrase, Chinese, So most of you, yeah. So, but there's another work that often appears like its strange doppelganger, covering almost exactly the same period, the lives of Chinggis, and that is the one Genghis or Genghis, but we'll be saying Chinggis Khan, and his son and successor Ögedei Khan. Sharing most of its stories, it's preserved in Chinese, but it's bristling with Mongolian terms and bearing an uncanny resemblance to Rashid-ad-Din's Persian language history of Chinggis Khan. Everything is puzzling about this doppelganger, including its name, Shengwu Qinjianglu in Chinese, or the chronicles of the personal campaigns of the sacred warrior, or Bogbater Beerdes and Timdiglov in Mongolian. Exactly 100 years ago, in 1926, the Chinese scholar Wang Guowei published a critical edition of this work. But since then, debate has still raged over it. When was it written? In what language? Why the strange title? And how does it relate to all of these other histories? So I've given you here a little summary of the talk, as you will see. So that way, if I run over and I have to stop suddenly, you'll know what we'll be talking about. The name, the parallel histories, and something about the text, how it was composed, and then I'll talk a little bit about what this text tells us, particularly about the way people were thinking about the Mongol Empire at the court of Kublai Khan, which is the emperor under whom this history was composed. In this lecture, I'll tell the story of this doppelganger, the secret history of the Mongols' little brother, born about 20 years after the secret history in the 1270s at the court of Kublai Khan, and then packaged and repackaged again and again by Mongol Yuan court historians, getting a new name with each makeover. Originally composed bilingually with each Mongolian sentence followed by its Chinese translation, the Mongolian original was taken to the Ilkhanate in what's now the Middle East and translated into Persian, where it then began to form the core of Rashid-ad-Din's history of the Mongol Empire. And for a century, the Chinese translation became the Mongol Yuan dynasty's founding narrative. This Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, as the title is best translated, and we'll talk about that, was not just the secret history's doppelganger, but for hundreds of years also we could say it was the secret history's press agent and public face. So this is the story of this work. Although the text of the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan as we have it today was reworked in the early 14th century, it was mostly compiled in the 1270s at the court of Kublai Khan, known in Mongolian also by his reign name Sitsin Khan, or the Wise Khan in Mongolian. In subject, this work begins with the birth of Temujin, or Chinggis Khan, and covers the unification of Mongolia, but then treats the conquest of North China as a foundational achievement in building the Mongol Empire, quite as important as the unification of Mongolia. Although it lacks the vivid description and characterization of the secret history of the Mongols or the Persian histories, it preserves a number of important stories of Chinggis Khan's early campaigns in North China, and is geographically and chronologically far more accurate and detailed than that in other sources. The text also continues into the reign of Chinggis Khan's son and successor, Ogedei Han with the final conquest of North China and the first stages in the Mongols' administrative reconstruction of that country. And even its account of the Sultan of Khwarezm in Central Asia, while not to be compared with the Persian historians in level of detail, is an unusually clear and accurate summary of the relative sequence of events. So it also preserves a number of important details on the unification of Mongolia that the secret historian omitted, such as the first known order of battle of Chinggis Khan's army. In short, this chronicle of the campaigns of Chinggis Khan, or campaigns for short, both fills an important gap in the history of the Mongol Empire and is itself an important source document in the intellectual history of the Mongol Empire. Now, see, campaigns of Chinggis Khan has remained relatively little studied, however. First noticed by Chinese historical and geographical scholarship in the late 18th century, the work only came to Japanese and Western attention in the early 20th century. The great scholar Wang Guowei used the manuscripts available to him to establish a mostly accurate text in 1926, as I said, a century ago. The great French scholar Paul Pelliot studied the text in detail, but his posthumous edition translated less than a fourth of the whole text. In 1979, another Chinese scholar, Jia Jingyan, completed a new critical edition based on much better manuscripts, but for decades this work circulated only in mimeograph. And since the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan's name itself is never mentioned in sources on the Mongol Empire, the very nature of the text, what language it was originally composed in, when and by whom, and what its relationship was to other texts mentioned elsewhere, has remained a puzzle. For these reasons, the historicity of the events described in the chronicle to this day remains relatively obscure. By studying these campaigns of Chinggis Khan, then my aim was not just to study a particular source, but to reconstruct an alternative view of the early Mongol Empire, one that was, at one point, dominant. The Secret History of the Mongols expresses the views of the old Mongols who supported Mongke Khan and his brother Adak Böke in the imperial family strife of 1251 to 1252 and 1260 to 1264. The Persian historians were shaped by the intellectual climate at the court of the Mongol Ilkhans in the Middle East. But by contrast, the chronicles of the campaigns of Chinggis Khan reflect the historical viewpoint of Hobelay Setsun Khan and his successors ruling in Daidu, the Mongol capital in the present-day Beijing. Although this viewpoint certainly had its weaknesses and its limitations and blind spots, it was a crucial part of how the Mongols in the empire viewed their own past, and its absence has therefore impoverished our understanding of the Mongols' empire rise and the disputes over its legacy. The campaigns of Chinggis Khan both expounded this mixed Mongol-Chinese view of the empire's founding in its text and embodied it in its history. The campaigns stems ultimately from a chronicle composed in the reign of Hobelay Setsun Khan by a unique method of bilingual cut and paste. This method allowed a mixed ethnic team of historians to work on the text together, even if they were not necessarily literate in each other's languages. So the story of this work's composition is another part of the hybrid, multilingual story of the Mongol Empire that has been a little bit obscured by the focus on the secret history of the Mongols. Now, to begin with, however, explanation should be given of the work's rather strange name, one which itself has a curious history. In Chinese, the work is titled Shengwu Qinzhenglu, which may be literally translated as chronicle or record of the personal campaigns of the sacred warrior. This is reflected in its modern Mongolian translation, Bogbater Beredes and Timdiglo. As noted there, this is not an ancient translation, this is a 20th century translation of the title. However, its idiomatic Chinese meaning is far from this literal English translation. The phrase Shengwu, sacred warrior, is actually just a posthumous title granted to Chinggis Khan by his grandson Kublai. Thus, as the late Inner Mongolian scholar Yekemengede Rinchen pointed out, it was actually a mistake for Mongolian translators to translate the title literally as Bogbater. Shengwu, in fact, simply means Chinggis Khan and should have been rendered as such. Paul Pelliot, in his French translation, was of the same opinion and titled his work Histoire des Campagnes de Chinggis Khan in 1951. The full title may thus be idiomatically rendered in English as the Chronicle of the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, or the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, or just Campaigns for short. It's a little bit of a lot of text there. I hope you might be able to see it. So the text of the Chronicles of Chinggis Khan occupies a position embedded within an interwoven net of citations from texts found in Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian. Again, one thing, as I often tell my students, if you do it today, we call it plagiarism. If you did it in the Middle Ages, it was just being a historian. Verbatim citation is a big part of this. Moreover, much of it, the reason I call it the secret history of the Mongols' little brother is that so much of the text was actually basically derived from the secret history of the Mongols. So one may wonder how much independent historical value it can have. In fact, however, precisely because of its embedded nature, precisely because it was the sort of intermediary between the secret history of the Mongols and these other works, such as that work of the Persian historian Rashid ad-Din and the Yuanshi, the study of the campaigns of Chinggis Khan is the key to opening up the history writing traditions of the Mongol Yuan Empire. This net of citations involves the four most important sources on the life of Chinggis Khan. Apart from the campaigns of Chinggis Khan itself, these sources are the secret history of the Mongols, the history of Chinggis Khan or Chinggis Khan in Rashid ad-Din's Compendium of Chronicles. Again, Compendium of Chronicles is a huge work, but we're focusing particularly on the biography of Chinggis Khan within that work. And finally, the first two analytic chapters of the Yuanshi, or History of the Yuan Dynasty, edited by Song Lian in the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, as well as the relevant chapters in that work's vast biographical section. So, to understand the campaigns of Chinggis Khan and its significance, one also has to thus understand its relationship to these other three extant sources on the Mongol Empire. These basic similarities and differences were summarized in chapter 1, and here we have, this was a previous, previous relationship of them, and I would say this is basically correct, except that within the word for Mongolian source, I would put here bilingual version of the campaigns of Chinggis Khan. But basically, we see secret history of the Mongols as the ancestor, the campaigns of Chinggis Khan and Rashid ad-Din as being sort of brother and sister, and then the Yuanshi being descended in some ways from this campaign of Chinggis Khan. But as some may have noticed, and I should also say, we have abundant documentation that the secret campaigns of Chinggis Khan was originally written in Mongolian. And this is particularly cases where we have words like tubigisidun mokhorhauran, which the un there is in fact a fossilized Mongolian genitive translated into the Chinese. There's many such examples of that. We can also say that the campaigns of Chinggis Khan was not a unified text. So some of you may have noticed there's a discrepancy between the campaigns of Chinggis Khan's title and its contents. The name has only Chinggis Khan's posthumous honorary title, yet it includes the entire reign of his son Okade. Why is that? And adding to the strangeness, there is a striking difference in style and even in conventions between the annals of Chinggis Khan in the work and the annals of Okade Khan in the work. Building on these observations, I've demonstrated, so you can see a few of these differences. So the topics are different. The Annals of Chinggis Khan has in-text notes. There are no in-text notes in the Annals of Okade. Okade himself is called Khan, and that's actually a posthumous title in his work, but he's called Taishan Huangdi in Okade's. Tolui is called Yichenoyan, or he's called Taishan Huang, and called Luoyang, and so on. And even the Chinese grammar is quite different. And this is, again, the grammar of the translation that's rather striking. So, Zhong, for example, is used 56 times in the Annals of Chinggis Khan, but not a single time in the other one. So once we word process it, we can have nice quantitative distinctions like that. I have demonstrated that the two portions, the Annals of Chinggis and the Annals of Okade, were originally separate works, which were yoked together by a much later editor to produce a work covering the two reigns. So the difference between the annals of Chinggis Khan and those of Okade Khan cover not just the inevitable differences of topics between two quite different reigns, but also ones of language, historical conventions, and transcriptions. At the same time, the two annals do share many characteristics. Most importantly, Okade's annals, despite the more China-centered focus and style, still do carry characteristic marks of having been translated from Mongolian. Now, as any sensitive reader of the Chinese will immediately sense, a sharp difference in style between the two parts. Corroborating this clear stylistic difference is that if you look at the introductions to the annals of Chinggis Khan and Ogedei Khan closely, you see that the latter originally had a full preface. Originally, the annals of Ogedei originally had a complete preface indicating that it was intended to be a freestanding work, but it was then edited to serve as an addendum to the annals of Chinggis Khan. Thus, the section on Ogedei was originally a separate work that was added to the annals of Chinggis Khan, explaining the major differences in styles and conventions that we see here. Now, the fact that both the annals of Chinggis Khan and the annals of Ogedei Khan were authentic chronicles explains this situation quite nicely. Now, the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan is the only surviving example from the Mongolian era of the genre of history writing called the authentic chronicles. Now, some of you may know this. If you're in sinology, you may know it under the rather awkward translation as veritable records. So I think authentic chronicle is a little bit more flowing. All sure Lu is the Chinese. This genre of history, dating back to the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century, covered each reign of a ruler as a separate work and was supposed to be compiled soon after a ruler's death from the court diaries kept during his reign. The authentic chronicles were, by the definition of the genre, chronicles of a single reign. Thus, if someone wanted to use these chronicles to make a connected history covering more than one reign, they would have to do exactly what was done in this case. Take previously separate chronicles and then sew them together with some editing at the suture point. Who did this and how they seemingly forgot to reflect that change in the title will be dealt with later. Now, although the Mongol rulers from Chinggis Khan had court scribes, they recorded the words of the Khans in a very different way from that of the Chinese scribes, and that not just by being in the Mongolian language. So that's when Kublai Khan and his advisors conceived the joint idea of producing the authentic chronicles of his predecessors. They had no obviously suitable material to work with. With the authentic chronicles of the emperors from Ogedei to Mongol Khan, we have almost ruled together from about 1229 to 1259, just before Kublai Khan, who came to power in 1260. We have almost no information about the composition process, except that complete drafts were presented to the throne from 1288 to 1296, and final versions were approved in 1303. But with the annals of Chinggis Khan, a combination of internal analysis of the text and references in historians enables us to trace the process of composition of his authentic chronicles in considerable detail. This relative abundance of information is because his authentic chronicles was both the most important and the most complicated of all of these authentic chronicles. Here I'm summarizing a very complex story. The editing of the authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan under Kublai Khan then proceeded in 4 stages. A first stage in which Han literati, Chinese literati, attempted to write an authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan with little or no concession to the Mongol historical traditions. Eventually, this failed. A second, more successful stage happened in which Mongolian sources, including the secret history of the Mongols, were incorporated into the work, and the work was basically completed, although it did not satisfy the Mongolian historians. The Chinese did not satisfy the Chinese historian. Chinese historian thought it's too Mongolian. It has too many Mongolian stuff in it. And the third stage, in which a Uyghur official, Saruman Sitchin, forced through this version. He basically said, this is what it's going to be, because that's what Kublai Khan wants. And a fourth stage under the latter's grandson and successor Temur, in which some light editing and reorganization slightly diminished the influence of the Mongolian sources and ideas. The 4 stages may be dated roughly as follows. The first, 1260 to 1268. The second, from 1273 to 1279. The third, from about 1285 to 1296. And the fourth, from 1298 to 1303. So the result was a unique hybrid product that retained much of the traditional Mongolian narratives, yet organized these narratives with a political and historical logic that, as I will explain, derived from the historiographical practices of the Song historian Ouyang Xiu. Now, as I mentioned, the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan was originally written in Mongolian. But there's an interesting, in a work whose sources were primarily Mongolian, like Chinggis Khan's authentic chronicles, but whose final product was to be presented in Chinese, you'd think the simplest procedure would simply be compile a Mongolian original and then translate the final draft into Chinese. But that's not how it happened at all. In fact, it happened in a much more complicated fashion. And for Chinggis Khan's annals, such an operation would not have fit the needs of the situation at all. The aim was to use mostly Mongolian language materials to compose an East Asian style chronicle. Now, it was the Chinese-speaking literati who were masters of that genre of composition, but they could not work in Mongolian and did not have even the security clearance to work with the secretist of the Mongols. In fact, the secretist of the Mongols, it's important to remember, was actually secret. That's why they call it secretist of the Mongols. Thus, those who knew only Chinese had to be given the ability to work with a selected range of Mongolian texts, much more extensive than would be eventually used for the history. The method chosen to enable Chinese editors to critically edit Mongolian texts was rather ingenious, even while being responsible for one of the text's most unprofessional-looking features, the inconsistencies in transcription. Here again, for those of you who can read Chinese, you can see that the same word, like Dudabin, if we want to say Dudabin, you have Dwarbun, Dwolubun, and Dwarbun. For Merkit, you have Mialichi, and Miarchi. So Merkit is constructed in 3 different ways, and so forth. For all of these different names, sometimes their Chinese characters are homonyms, sometimes they're actually slightly different pronunciations. So within the same book, why is the same Mongolian name being written in many different Chinese ways? Not only so strikingly, the inconsistency, what we find is when you map them out, the inconsistencies cluster in such a way that the annals of Chinggis Khan can be divided into blocks. You actually get chunks. First this one, that one, and so on. Each of which was within itself consistent in description. Composition of these divisions into text blocks, if you compare the divisions into text blocks, corresponds with what appears to be divisions of material drawn from particular sources. So clearly what this indicates is that the Mongolian text was not translated all at once in a single pass. Instead, before any history was actually composed, diverse Mongolian historical materials were translated separately into Chinese by different translators who did not mutually compare their transcriptions to ensure consistency. The compilers then cut and pasted a selection of these Chinese translations to produce the annals of Chinggis Khan. This assembly work was done by editors who were clearly unwilling to alter the language any more than was absolutely necessary. This idea of verbatim citation of sources, again, is a feature of Chinese historiography. Now here, this is the famous block print of the Mongolian classic of filial piety. But what you'll notice about it is, if you read it, you have so for example, Sansai Zhang Tiqi. So there's a phrase here, and then following the Chinese immediately is the same sentence in Mongolian, and another Chinese sentence, then the Mongolian sentence, another Chinese sentence. I would guess in these authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan, the original form was the opposite, because we know that the Mongolian was the primary language. So you'd have a Mongolian sentence, it's Chinese translation. Mongolian sentence is Chinese translation. So let's say you had in a room some scholars who were Chinese speaking, but who were not Chinese speaking, and who didn't speak Mongolian. You also had some scholars who were Mongolian speaking, but didn't speak Chinese. They need to agree on which sentences to delete and which sentences to keep. They could have oral translation, but they couldn't read each other's language. But this way, if they say, oh, that sentence there, that's not a good sentence, that's irrelevant detail. Since the Mongolian is followed immediately by the Chinese, you can just snip it out, throw it away, and move on to the next one. So each of these so this whole thing can be compiled bilingually by scholars who were not necessarily expert in each other's languages. So that's how I argue the actual authentic chronicles of Chinggis Khan was actually produced. Now, Normally, once you produce these authentic chronicles, one for Chinggis Khan, one for Ogedei, one for Guyuk, one for Tolui, one for Mongol, huge one for Kublai Khan, and so on. Once you actually produce them, normally these authentic chronicles were to be used only in the palace for the edification of the succeeding emperors and high officials. The completion of the final version of the authentic chronicles of these 5 reigns before Kublai Khan in 1303 would have marked the final step for those of Chinggis Khan and his 4 immediate successors. But just about 15 years later, though, the authentic chronicles of the early Mongol emperors were reorganized a second time, this time into a work that reached a wider public. This rewriting began in the reign of the Emperor Ayurbarwada, whose Mongolian reign name is Boyantu, Chinese name is Renzong, from 1311. He reigned from 1311 to 1320. He initiated several initiatives focusing on dynastic history and the legacy of his predecessors. In May 1313, he ordered another round. He ordered the selection of officials to draft what he was called the Guoshe, or dynastic history. This is what we have in the issue. Although a direct description of what this dynastic history is nowhere given, it appears that this historical initiative was what created what would be later known as the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan. There are many other texts on early Mongol Yuan histories, which are certainly known to have been created as part of this initiative. One of them was the Dongping Wang Shijia, or Family History of the Princes of Dongping. Despite the Chinese name, this is actually Mokhale. So the Family History of Mokhale and his descendants, compiled by Yuan Yongzheng. Other historical records from this work were compiled by Tsagan, who was a Mongolized Tajik from whose ancestors had lived in what's now Afghanistan and ended up being deported to what's now North China, became Mongolized, and he's said to have, quote, understood the scripts of many countries and translated several works of Chinese history into Mongolian for the Boyantu Khan. One work he is said to have translated was the Huangyuan Taizu Shengwu Kaitianji, or record of how Chinggis Khan, great founder of the sovereign Yuan dynasty, initiated the empire, or initiated the state, translated different ways. This is, in fact, the first known reference to the text which would later become known as the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan. This reference thus confirms that the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan was compiled in Boyantu Khan's reign. But it was in fact only the first volume of what was supposed to be a 2-volume work, the second volume being titled the Qinzhenglu, or Chronicle of the Imperial Campaigns, that abridged the authentic chronicles from Chinggis Khan to Kublai Khan. So this is why then, therefore, Ogedei and Chinggis Khan's annals had to be combined, because someone wanted to produce from these authentic chronicles of each reign a combined history of the rise of the Mongol Empire from Chinggis Khan to Kublai that would cover all of these dynasties. Now, as far as we can tell, this 2-volume dynastic history made very few changes in the annals of Chinggis Khan or Ogedei. The most interesting change was the addition under the year 1226 of the statement that in 1226, Chinggis Khan was then exactly 60 years old. Now, you can do the math, or I can just do it for you. This would put his birth in the Dinghai year, or 1167, or the pig year in the 12-animal zodiac. This dating, now the interesting thing is this date directly contradicts one from the original authentic chronicle of Chinggis Khan, found in section 28, which puts his birth year in a horse year, in 1162. So the same work, this has been a real puzzler for editors who are editing this work. One passage says he was born in a horse year. If you calculate it, it says he was born in a horse year. Another one says he was born in a pig year. Well, as I said, this is because apparently they were added at different times. The newly added date aligned Chinggis Khan's birth with a numerological theory that had gained popularity across the Mongol Empire early in the 14th century. According to this theory, Chinggis Khan was born, like his grandson Kublai, in a pig year, which was the same animal zodiac year in which the conquest of the Song dynasty was completed. By promoting this theory, Song Chinese thought to confirm both the legitimacy of Mongol rule and to link that rule to the Song dynasty only, as opposed to the Jin dynasty. In this version, Kublai Khan and the Song founder Song Taizu were both born in pig years, 1215 and 927. Were born in pig years, 1167 and 927. Were enthroned in Gongsheng. Kublai Khan was born in pig year, 1215 and 927. Were enthroned in Gongsheng years, 1260 and 960, and conquered South China in the same two Yihai and Bingzi years, 1275, 1276, 975, 976. This correlation confirmed the legitimacy of the Yuan as a repetition of the Song, thereby excluding the Jin dynasty that ruled North China. However, while Kublai and Song Taizu were both born in pig years, they differed in the 60-year cycle. But according to this theory, Chinggis Khan was born in the exact same Ding Hai year, as the Chinese would put it, as Song Taizu. So it was his birth, not that of Kublai, which marked the initiation of the cycle of dynastic reunification. That Kublai was also born in a pig year eventually confirmed his role as the consummator of what was begun by Chinggis Khan. So everything, pig years all down. So the completion of this two-volume history with its new date marked the final iteration of the authentic chronicle's history of the Mongolian founding. The editing job was rather crude. They're adding contradictory dates of Chinggis Khan's birth. But crude or not, all the changes made strengthened the continuity of the Mongol Empire and the Yuan dynasty. The conclusion emphasized how the political movements that began with the unification of Mongolia did not reach its natural conclusion until the conquest of the Song. The inclusion of this dating in the new two-volume history, even in the presence of contradictory dates, closed the circle linking Chinggis Khan to the completion of the unification of China. Adding to its interest to Ayar Barwada Boyantu Khan must have been the fact that he himself also was born in a pig year. So Boyantu Khan could now see himself in the 14th century as being a renewer of yet another pig year cycle under which Chinggis and Kublai had led to the building of the Mongolian Empire. So thus repackaged under Ayar Barwada Khan, the work began to be widely disseminated. Soon after 1319 or so, when the new two-volume history was completed, we begin to see citations from it and other Chinese histories covering the Mongolian dynasty. But eventually, after the fall of the dynasty and the flight of the Mongol court back to China, a South China scholar, Tao Zhongyi, copied one of the two volumes into his personal miscellaneous kind of reading notes where he would take excerpts from all the important books he'd read, called the Shuofu, or Purlieus of Exposition. But in so doing, he made a peculiar choice. As I've mentioned, the Emperor Boyantu Khan condensed all the history from Chinggis Khan to Kublai into two volumes. First volume was the Huangyuan Taizu Shangwu Kaitenji, record of how Chinggis Khan, great founder of the sovereign Yuan dynasty, initiated the state. The second volume was entitled Qinzhenglu, or Chronicle of the Imperial Campaigns, not meaning the campaigns of Chinggis Khan, but the campaigns of his successor, Mongke Khan, and Kublai Khan himself. So this Qinzhenglu was really wasn't Chinggis Khan at all. Sadly, Tao Zhongyi did not copy the second volume into his history. It's now lost to history. But in copying the first volume, he still combined the two titles, taking the Shengwu from the first title and Qinzhenglu for the second, to give the total a single title, Shengwu Qinzhenglu, or Chronicle of the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan. And with that odd decision, combining the posthumous title of Chinggis Khan with a reference to the campaigns of his successors, we've completed the story of how the present-day campaigns of Chinggis Khan came to be. So, and how its odd title came to be, how it came to exist. Now I'll talk about some of the ways in which this text gives us a perspective on the founding of the Mongol Empire and the secret history of Mongols. Now, although the campaigns repackages many of the stories of Chinggis Khan from the secret history, there are a fair number which are completely original to this work. For example, near the beginning of the book, there is an episode of how Chinggis Khan wins over allies while engaging in a Batu hunt. And I'm going to read you the whole episode, give you a little bit of a flavor of it. It's kind of, again, as you hear it, you might want to think of it's a kind of Mongolian story, very much set in Mongolia, but it's retold in this very kind of clipped, terse, sort of Chinese analytic style, although with some interesting twists. Here is the whole episode. I've re-Mongolized some. There's certain Chinese translationese, which I have moved back to the Mongolian original. Again, in translating this, I also compared, of course, with Rashid-ad-Din's Persian version, which does not have those Chinese features. So here's the story. One of their clans, the Juriat tribe, lived near us being the Mongols, and once went hunting at the moors of Uchal-Jalamas. Chinggis Khan was also holding a Batu hunt at the same time, and their deployments by chance came with each other and subsequently joined up. Chinggis Khan said, "May we stay the night together in this place?" They said, "The horsemen hunting number 400. There's not enough provisions, and we have already sent half of them back home." Chinggis Khan said, "I will order assistance to be given to those staying the night with us." The next day, their circles again joined. Chinggis Khan treated them as guests and drove the wild beasts towards their deployments, letting them capture enough to satisfy their hearts. The followers were grateful and said to one another, "Although the Taichot are brothers of ours, they often seize our carts and horses and rob us of our food and drink. Could this be the man who will later be kind to us?" And they departed for home, full of admiration. Chinggis Khan therefore sent someone to request, "Can you come and make an alliance?" The head of the Judit, Ulugbaatar, took counsel with the clan head Maui Yatana, who replied, "What evil have the Taichot done to us? With them treating us as elder and younger brothers, how could we suddenly surrender to him?" And did not agree. But Ulugbaatar with Tagai Dalu then led their tribe to come and submit, addressing Chinggis Khan thus: "We have come, bringing wives without husbands and horses without herdsmen, for it will be the cause of the sons of the Taichot senior ladies to punish us and kill us. We pledge to abandon our kin and follow duty, and to do so openly." Chinggis Khan said, "It is as if I was in a deep sleep, and you pulled my hair and woke me up. And sitting up straight, you lifted up my beard and made me stand up. What you have said will always be in my heart. Where your armies reach, I will help you with all my force." Having made a covenant, the two men later betrayed their word and turned back in rebellion. His clansman Goten Hurchang hated Tagai Dalu for his fickleness and later killed him. The Juriat had completely fallen apart. So this is a really interesting story. What's interesting about it is the examples, of the massive ring hunts. We don't have a similar sort of expedition in the secret history of the Mongols of the role of those large-scale hunts, including information on the numbers involved, 400 people, for example, in one big hunt, as well as on how the Judit were allied with the Taichot as the sons of the junior wives. So it's kind of a relationship of this family is from the senior wives, the Judit are junior, they're from the junior wives. The speech of Ulugbaatar and Tagai Dalu and Chinggis Khan's response about pulling a beard and pulling hair and things like that, it seems to derive from probably some kind of Mongolian poetry, but we don't, in the Chinese translation, you don't really kind of get the poetic. If it was in the secret history of the Mongols, it'd probably be much nicer. But at least it's preserved here in this Chinese version. Although it's not, and this sounds a little strange. Now, inclusion of this kind of material here was only the first stage of composition. Another issue, and one which had deep implications for how this history would present the Mongol imperial founding, was that of format and criterion of relevance and inclusion. Now, the East Asian historical tradition offered several models for how you would compose imperial annals. These included the basic annals, or we should call them origins and annals, of the so-called standard histories, the more detailed authentic chronicles, which I already mentioned, from which the basic annals were derived through a process of condensation, and multi-dynastic annalistic histories, exemplified by the Zizhitongjian, or the Comprehensive Narrative Government, written by Sima Guang in 1019-1086. For their own reading and listening edification and pleasure, Mongol emperors almost always preferred these multi-reign dynastic histories. Despite this fact, however, it was the Banji, usually translated as basic annals, but in this period better understood as origin annals, of Ouyang Xiu's new history of the Tang Dynasty, which formed the model for the authentic chronicles. So, again, as I mentioned, the authentic chronicles were when they were created, the name was Authentic Chronicle, but the model for it was these origins and annals, which is actually a much briefer sort of work. Internal analysis of the structure of the Authentic Chronicles for Chinggis Khan and Ogedei shows that this was one Ouyang Xiu's guidance exercised the strongest influence on the historians under Kublai Khan. So what did Ouyang-Hsiu intend by these origins and annals? So his student, in a commentary, explained how Ouyang-Hsiu understood this. Origins, Bun, annals, Ji. The term origins and annals conforms to long-standing practice. Bun implies, or origins implies, tracing the origins of a dynasty's ascent, while Ji, annals, infers a sequential arrangement of events chronologically. Before an imperial accession, the narrative is overly detailed to explore the origins of a ruler's rise and expose the ripple or rush of dynastic ascent. After an imperial accession, the narrative is brief. The exalted station and weighty responsibility of monarchs lends great import to their deeds. The narrative is concise. Only concision allows normative rules of composition, fa, to be established. Once the enthronement occurred, Ouyang-Hsiu decreed that only 5 types of affairs were to be recorded. Affairs of major dimensions, actions that changed the ancient way of doing things, unusual events, events with symbolic significance, and events which had later repercussions. Everything else had to be eliminated. Now, the authentic chronicles of Chinggis Khan and Ogedei Khan, as we see them slightly repackaged in the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, exactly fit Ouyang-Hsiu's origins and annals model. As a result, by tracing where his origins, his narrative discursive account, becomes annals, bullet points, we can see the authentic chronicle mapping narratively a consistent argument about the legitimacy and right extent of the Mongol dynasty. The first translation from origins to annals occurs in the year 1205, section 32 on, when the first stage of the dynastic founding, the unification of Mongolia, was complete. Now, if you know the secret history of the Mongols, you may remember that when the secret history of the Mongols, with its different historiographical model, comes to unification, instead of suddenly cutting down the narrative, they have this vast long section of digression detailing the rewards given to Chinggis Khan's followers. So here we see different model of history results in different composition. But from the surrender of the Uyghurs in 1209 on, however, a second period of origins begins, with a detailed exploration of every ripple or rush of dynastic ascent as the great founder, Chinggis Khan, shuttles between North China's Jin dynasty and the Sultan of Khwarazm in the west. With Ogedei, one immediately moves into the period of stripped-down narratives with normative rules, except for the completion of the conquest of the Jin, which is dealt with in considerable detail. Striking by its complete absence is the great campaigns in Eastern Europe after 1235. So the campaigns of Chinggis Khan simply doesn't mention anything in the conquest of Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, whatever. Just not there. So putting these facts together, we see a 3-part structure of the empire up through Ogedei's time. The conquest of 1, the various rivals in Mongolia, 2, the Jin dynasty's Altan Khan or Golden Dynasty, Golden Khan, and 3, the Uyghur Idikut and the Khwarezmian Sultan in the west. Together they represented the foundation of the Mongol Empire, the 3 thrones, so to speak, on which the Mongol Khans ascended. 3 thrones. Although the Song dynasty is dealt with only glancingly in Ogedei's annals, the conquest of the Song under Kublai was certainly held to be the 4th and final step of Mongolian dynastic unification. Some conquests are excluded from this central status because they were geographically peripheral. For example, the Tumat and other forest peoples of Siberia, the remoter parts of Iran, the Molayid heretics in India, they're all represented as something peripheral to the main body of the Mongol Empire. Judging from the evidence of the basic annals in the Unshared sections 2 and 3, the same treatment was given for the 4 great Western campaigns against the Kipchaks and the Caliphate under Ogedei and Monkip. Other conquests were secondary because the regimes under which they were directed were merely regional monarchs, not true rivals for imperial power. While the Heshi or Kashan lands in northwest China were certainly an integral part of the Mongol Empire's territory, the legitimacy of the Tangled dynasty, which ruled it, is clearly denied. It is simply a local regime, not a genuine imperial dynasty, and hence its conquest is described only briefly. The Ongut of section 29 play a similar role as a subordinate realm related by marriage to the Mongol imperial house, which survives the dynastic transition by timely surrender. This distinction through narrative detail was accentuated by the use of the term Wang, king, for rulers of certain East Asian regimes, the Uyghur Idikut, the Tangled ruler Liang, the three short-lived regimes of Yoke, Wanu, and Changchi, and the Korean ruler. Now, king may sound like a very high rule, but king here is being opposed to emperor. So they're kings, not emperors. This title of king, in one sense, distinguished them from Mongolia's Buju, or tribal rulers, but on the other hand, also denoted their status as realms which are not eligible to seek for ultimate sovereignty in the way that the Jin ruler or the Karachitai ruler did. The surrender of the Uyghurs and the conquest of the Khwarezmian Sultan in the West could easily have been treated in the same summary fashion as the Tangut, Korean, or Kipchak campaigns. Instead, however, the compilers of the authentic chronicle of the great founder devoted considerable care to interweaving Mongolian language sources to produce a strikingly accurate and comprehensive summary of the main military actions in conquering Central Asia. This historiographic inclusion of the West, and by the West I mean the west of Mongolia, there's to say the motto is now the modern Middle East, is one of the fundamental formative elements of the dynasty. This was an important statement of imperial policy at Kublai's court. By treating the Turkic West as an integral part of the empire, even though it was no longer securely controlled by Kublai Khan after 1285, Sarman and behind him Kublai Khan were giving the Mongol and Han literati notice that these Western immigrants, or Sumuren, from that region were legitimate members of the court and could never be systematically excluded or disadvantaged. More than just individual immigrants from the West, they had a corporate identity in the empire as one of the four seats of the empire, which legitimated the retention of their own religio-political viewpoint and even the continued availability of that viewpoint as policy for the empire. And although the Uyghurs were only ruled by a king, the authentic chronicle of the great founder, this Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, pictures it not only as one of the two component realms of the empire in the West, along with Khwarezm, but also marks it as the origins of proper court ritual. So in section 37.1, recording how the Uyghur Idikut voluntarily surrendered, his address to Chinggis Khan is the first appearance in the Chinese text of the usual markers of correct vassal-ruler relations. His words to the ruler are memorials. He refers to himself as vassal. He addresses Chinggis Khan as emperor, emphasizes his sincerity, and offers to devote himself to the emperor like a dog or a horse. So retaining this language in the authentic chronicle implicitly affirms that the Uyghurs, not Khitans, not Han, or not Northern Chinese, were the ones who initiated proper ritual for lord and vassal at the Mongol court. And such an initiation, as recorded in history, established a binding precedent that made the Uyghurs the most vital single member of civil officialdom of the Mongol Yuan court. Now, this idea of a fourfold seat of the empire, Mongolia, North China, the West, and South China, contrasted with both Mongolian and Chinese literati views. In the Mongolian view, as seen in The Secrets to the Mongols, and here it's a little small, sort of concentric circles, the empire's one seat was Mongolia, the Iski Toruktu Olis, the people of the felt walls. The secret history of the Mongols' narrative of the unification of this area, completed by section 202, is then followed by an elaborate description of the new regime's ruling class. Surrounding this central Mongolia, the secret historian arranged a ring of realms related by marriage, the Karluks, the Uyghurs, Oirats, and other Siberian people, and then subordinate appanages of the various princes of the blood. Beyond them is yet more foreign lands of the Khitat, or North China, Tangut, and Khwarezmian West, Khurramsher, Sartol, and finally there's an outer circle of the remotest people of the West and East, the Caliph of Baghdad, the Kangla, the Kipchaks, the Ruthenians, or Oros, Russians, the Ossetians, Asut and their allies, and Korea, all of whose subjections described in sections 247, 68, and 270, 74. In other words, the empire is envisioned as a series of concentric circles around the center, Mongolia. On the other hand, though, Chinese, and here again we'll go back to Han Chinese definitions of their core area, they had their own view of empire, one in which North China was the focus, and Mongolia was kind of a hidden source. At the same time, the contrast with the secrets of the Mongols is stark. So these comparisons show how the historiographical vision of Kublai's court was neither clearly Mongol, nor clearly Chinese, but a unique mixture of the two, together with an immigrant perspective from the Uyghur and Islamic West. Now, in his commentary on the Wudai Shiji, Ouyang Shou's student Xu Wudang had pointed out that only by stripping it down to the basic elements, can you have normative rules to be established. In other words, after a lengthy narrative of the rise of the dynasty, once the imperial founder was enthroned, the editorial focus turns to using precise rules to describe political events in precisely defined ways. Now, Xu Wudang described Ouyang Shou's rules for composition. Those rules were not followed in the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan, but what was followed is these rules that are set out here. So this I basically created by induction from the actual text. Gong is used for an attack by an army on walled cities. Fa Ke is a successful attack on a walled place. Fa is a big campaign. A Tao is a small campaign. And a Zheng is really interesting. That's a campaign by a legitimate emperor. And again, probably there's some Mongolian origins of this, some Mongolian originals of them. Unfortunately, it's not reconstructible at the present. But if we follow these rules, we can actually observe, again, a consistent, if somewhat surprising argument about when Chinggis Khan became the legitimate monarch. In this argument, Chinggis Khan derived his legitimacy not from being descended from Burtachan and Guamaro, or not from his Borgia Kiat ancestors and the secretist of the Mongols, nor from his conquest of the thrones of North and South China, as the Chinese literati wanted to say. Instead, Chinggis Khan's legitimacy was derived from the conquest of the Kerit and the Naman thrones, these two big kingdoms in central and western Mongolia. This argument can be seen in the transition from Fa to Zheng. As mentioned above, Fa is clearly used both for legitimate and illegitimate rulers, but Zheng is used only for legitimate rulers alone. Thus, it's surprising and noteworthy that the first campaign of Chinggis Khan's referred to in which he Zheng, or he has a legitimate conquest, is that of 1205 against the Merkit. In other words, only after he's already conquered both the Kerit and Naman kingdoms in central and western Mongolia. Following that, however, the word Zheng becomes routine in referring to Chinggis Khan's campaigns in North China, the West, and the Tangleds. His commanders are also engaged in such Zheng campaigns in Siberia and against the Karakitai. But before the conquest of the Naman, however, Chinggis Khan's campaigns are all referred to with the word Fa or Tao, ones that acknowledge a preponderance of power, but in purely pragmatic and not normative sense. Only when, interesting enough though, the one time before his completion of the unification of Mongolia, in which Chinggis Khan is said to do a Zheng, that is to say a legitimate conquest, is when he is conquering together with Ong Khan, ruler of the Kerit. So, and this is also used for Ong Khan's solo campaign. So when Chinggis Khan and Ong Khan are allies, but Ong Khan is campaigning himself against the Merkit, he is also doing Zheng, a legitimate emperor's campaign. So the implication is unavoidable. It was Ong Khan, not Chinggis Khan, who was the legitimate ruler of Mongolia up until 1205. And it was only by conquering him and then conquering the Naman to reunite the country as a whole that Chinggis Khan became the legitimate sovereign. This theory of legitimacy is amplified by the use of another Chinese word, beng, which for the death of Ong Khan's father, Horchikas Boyra Khan. Beng is a term used in Chinese only for the death of a legitimate emperor. The only other place where it's found in the campaigns of Chinggis Khan is with the death of Ogedei Khan. He's also said to beng. So, to sum up, the campaigns of Chinggis Khan and the authentic chronicles of Chinggis Khan and Ogedei that they sprung from were unique hybrid creations, packaging mostly Mongolian materials and Mongolian ideas about the nature of the empire and its legitimacy in forms established by the Chinese historical tradition. So you could say, Stalin famously talked about national informed socialist in content. Well, Kublai Khan wanted Chinese informed Mongolian in content for these historical works. Despite being in their original form called authentic chronicles, they were actually modeled on the origins and annals genres. The Song dynasty histories of Ouyang were the inspiration for their composition and organization. Yet these methods were deployed precisely to make points about the significance about the importance of Mongolia, the importance of Uyghurs and other non-Chinese realms that were points were profoundly uncongenial to China's northern and southern historians. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Yes, I'm aware. This I should say this is something of an abstract of my book with Bridwell Press, and there's Anthony over there, the publisher, the editor. The book is maybe about 1,000 pages or something. So contracting it to 20 was a bit of a job. So I'd be happy to try to explain anything that puzzled you.
That's great. We have plenty of time for questions, and please note that we are being recorded, and any of your questions and comments will be included in the library's online archive. So please, we have two of my division colleagues, as mic runners, who can bring the mic to you if you have questions. So.
Don't be shy. Yes, Anthony.
Teasing out this very complicated history. I mean, in terms of like digging into this text or texts plural.
Yeah, the most complex thing about it is this layers of editing. The layers of editing that in the 1270s, they did one layer, they did another layer in the 1280s, they did another layer in 1303, they did another layer in 1319, another layer in 1370. And I will be honest with you, if there are other scholars of this text who, if they were here, would be telling you, no, Atwood got it all wrong. It's all, so they would have their own viewpoint. I'm actually fairly confident about my reconstruction of the event, but it's very complex. But again, one of the funny things about it is weird. When you read the text as we have it in Chinese today, again, was Chinggis Khan born in a horse year or a pig year? Both of them are there. They also have another big dating mistake when they tried to get the equivalences with the Song Dynasty. With the Song Dynasty regnal dates, they have two of them. They're off by 60 years again. Another real goofy stuff like that. So it's just kind of keeping the different layers separate. Was really, I think, the most difficult part about it. And that's why I talked about its tangled fate. It's very tangled. I will say, though, there's another thing. Unfortunately, I had to cut it because I wanted to keep time for questions. But interesting enough, there are actually 3 pieces of information from this Campaigns of Chinggis Khan that are preserved, and the pieces of information that appear to be only in the Campaigns of Chinggis Khan. They're not in the Secrets to the Mongols. They're not in any other source that I know of. But they're also found in Asrex Nirtintuch, which is a 17th century Mongolian chronicle. One of them is that Ong Khan and his son, Ilkha Sengum, they get driven out of Mongolia when Chinggis Khan conquers them. And one of the interesting things is this Campaigns of Chinggis Khan says Ilkha Sengum first went to the Tangleds, then he went to Tibet, and then he fled from Tibet to Kusan, which is Kucha in modern-day Xinjiang. Now, the Asrex Nirtintuch says that Sengum, he so he fled to Tibet and then disappeared. So that's the only, so interesting enough, there's also, it looks like some Mongolian version of this Campaigns of Chinggis Khan did circulate in Mongolia. And there's a couple of other references to that, which again, you want the full story, you can read the book. So that it was getting those strata, those layers. I'm sorry if I kind of confused you with all of the different terminology, but I'm just trying to show you how it works.
We should also say that the book is going to be free.
Open access, yes, it'll be open access, so that'll be nice.
Susan Lawrence.
Hey, Susan.
Congratulations, Chris. This seems like just an incredible, monumental achievement. Well done. And fascinating talk and funny. So well done on that too. A couple of questions. So I have to ask about the pig ear. So the pig ear was so incredibly important, legitimacy in that era. Did that continue? Did being born in a pig ear continue to matter as the centuries rolled on? Question one.
Yeah.
Question two, you had a slide up there about the different conceptions of the territory that they cared about. And you had a slide saying that the Han were less interested in including the Uyghurs and the Westerners as poor peoples. So clearly that has changed.
Yes, yes.
But I'm wondering what era are we talking about when the Han scholar's definition was that? And when did it evolve to something else, if it did, as it did? I'll stop there, maybe not to take up too much time. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so the pig ear story is a really interesting one. The first person who figured it out or noticed it was Rushdie. Also says it's really important. Rushdie, though, has a different version of Chinggis Khan's birth. He puts it in 1155, which is also a pig year, but it's a different pig. It's 12 years earlier, before 1167. So, there was a German scholar of Persian history who noted this. Why does Rushdie think it's so important to have the pig year, Chinggis Khan be born in the pig year? And he thought maybe they're Muslims and they kind of want to secretly make fun of Chinggis Khan by saying he's born in the pig year. But this is not true, because the earliest example of this pig year story is in Chinese. And the earliest example is around 1300. So it does appear to be something like a completely, I guess what you call it, a ad hoc theory. The key idea of it was, when the Mongols conquered China, China was not unified. There was the Jin dynasty in the north under the Altan Khan or the Golden Khan, and then it was actually Jurchen, not Chinese. And then there was the Song dynasty in the south. The key thing that the Song dynasty, southern scholars wanted to show was that the Jin dynasty, because they hated the Jin dynasty. In fact, several Song dynasty writers are like, yeah, the Mongols conquered the Jin, slaughtering them all. It's great. It's wonderful. They had quite a schadenfreude about the fall of the Jin dynasty. So the idea of the pig ear theory was to link Mongols directly to the Song dynasty, and thereby say that the Song dynasty was the only legitimate dynasty of China at that time. And the Jin dynasty were a bunch of evil usurpers. But the Mongols have now reunified China, and they are the legitimate successors of the Song dynasty. So in this, it appears that was why the theory was created. I haven't found anything further beyond. And so a number of scholars have actually looked at this. Joe Shulin in Inner Mongolia has written some articles about this, and he can't find anything earlier than that. So it appears once the Mongol Empire falls and nobody has to really worry about it anymore, the whole pig ear theory just disappears. It doesn't appear to be a sort of a general thing. It's more just kind of solving this particular problem of linking the Mongols, particularly to the Song dynasty. Now, for this definition, this is Han literati under the Mongol Empire exclusively. And again, Han literati, and as you may know, under the Mongol Empire, they had the famous four classes. They had the Mongols at the top, and then the Sumuren, or immigrants, were number two, and then the Han Chinese. When they call Han, though, they meant only northerners. So if you were from the Song dynasty, you were not Han. You were Southern. So Han and Southern are kind of different. So the Han Chinese scholars, when they talked about this, and again, that was a section that I deleted for the sake of time. But when they talk about it, they usually will say the Mongols rose in the far north, and then they conquered, and then they began to invade North China, and then they conquered. Chinggis Khan conquered the main cities, and then he conquered Sichuan, and then he conquered Shanxi, and then he conquered, and a lot of details about North China. And then he says, then they conquered the Song, and that's it, the South. So the South is there, it's important, but it's not, the North is really where the action is, because the Mongols actually, unlike almost all other previous Chinese dynasties, who literati base, so to speak, was in Jiangnan area, they're roughly around what's now Shanghai. The Mongols were very sort of North China centric, and most of their officials were North Chinese. And those North Chinese officials wanted to sort of claim their prior, the Mongols were friends with us before they became friends with you guys from South China. So that made them sort of special. And yeah, so the other thing was, of course, that in the court, there were all of these immigrants coming in from the West. Immigrants coming in and stealing jobs has been a theme for many centuries. And Han Chinese literati said, we have quite a bit of statements about like these Westerners. There's one famous one. Li Ye says, Kublai Khan asked them, "What should I use? Western," again, basically meaning Uyghur and Middle Eastern officials. Should I use these Uyghur and Middle Eastern officials? And Leah says, well, some of them are good, but the vast majority of them are unbelievably greedy and ambitious. So no. That was the feeling among these officials. So it was really very much a kind of husband and two rival wives kind of thing. The husband was the Mongols, and the one rival wife was the Han literati who said, you should be loyal to us. And then what they thought was the mistress of the illegitimate woman, that was the Han was the Western officials. So in this case, the issue is really keeping these people out of the Mongol Empire, out of the court. I mean, obviously, they didn't have a problem with Uyghur lands or Central Asia all the way up to Iran being considered part of the Yuan dynasty. What they had a problem was with these people being considered as eligible to be high officials. In fact, the highest officials. And not only that, eligible to tell the Mongols, you know what? These Chinese officials have their tax systems. They're okay, but you know what? Our Persian tax systems are better. You should use our Persian tax systems. And this debate over which tax system to use got really fierce and really hot. And so again, it's that, and I think it's still today that yes, although literati may feel in China may feel it's very important to have Uyghurs included within the empire. I don't think they're particularly interested in having Uyghurs use their Islamic traditions as ways of governing China as a whole. I think that would still be true. I should also say that the West here, again, Shiyu, that's what's used in the translation. That's actually translating all throughout Mongolian Sartol, which is the word that it originally means basically what we would consider sort of Middle Easterners, sort of people who are, it's a classic description of high noses, deep eyes, and large beards, that kind of thing. So, hope I answered your question, Susan.
I can keep going if others don't have any questions. I have just one more question, which is all of this. I'm just curious how it all resonates today. So in China, in Mongolia, how important are these narratives? What do people sort of read into them today? How important are they for the way people talk about history, so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. I would say not very important at all, actually. And I would say I want to say they don't like my conclusions. I'll tell you, Chinese don't like it because this idea that an authentic chronicle was ever, or a veritable record, as sinologists oftentimes call it, that any such chronicle could ever be composed primarily with Mongolian materials and in Mongolian. I gave a talk basically setting forth, actually in much greater detail, the reason for my conclusions. And an Air Mongolian scholar, sort of said, well, he says, then he basically had his pingja, or his evaluation. And he says, well, he said that, but then he said, our traditional Chinese scholarship says this. Similarly, Zhang Fan at Peking University, he said, I explained all of this, and then he says, well, then awaits verification. And I think, and again, I'm fairly confident. Again, I've set it out at great length that you can read it. I'm fairly confident in what I'm saying. But I think, again, the idea that the authentic chronicle genre is seen as like the absolutely sort of pure Chinese imperial history genre, and to say that under the Mongols they actually did it in Mongolian, and then it was compiled in Mongolian, and you could that's kind of a real problem. But I think also from the Mongolian point of view, and of course there are many Mongolians in the room right now, and you can one of the points I'm trying to make here is that empire and hybridity go together. You can't actually have an empire without compromising your what you may think of as your ethnic or sort of ancestral identity. I would say this is, for example, in things like the collapse of the Soviet Union. I would think that many scholars have pointed out that a large part of this was Russians feel like that in the Soviet Union, that in order to rule the Soviet Union, we Russians had to be constantly compromising our Russianness, and we just want to be Russian without apology. The trouble was, one of the things that meant was that therefore, the Ukrainians would be Ukrainian without apology, and so on, and Estonians and so on. So I think the same thing is true of the Mongol Empire. One of the points I'm trying to make here is that Kublai Khan is, as many of you know, Kublai Khan is kind of a controversial figure in Mongolia because he moved the capital from Mongolia to Beijing, to Daidu, and to Shangdu. And so, that's he's sometimes considered to be a sort of betrayer of the Mongols. So one of the points I'm trying to make is, in one sense, what he did do, he did use Chinese historiographical tradition. But the other side I'm trying to say here is that he was using Chinese forms, but a lot of the content he was trying to put in that is Mongolian content. So in a sense, the Yuan dynasty culture was a hybrid culture. It was not a purely Mongolian culture. It was not a purely Chinese culture. And in that sense, that hybrid in 1368, when the Mongol Empire got kicked back into, the court got kicked back into Mongolia, that culture kind of disappeared. So one of the things I'm trying to do with my scholarship is to recreate a lost culture, recreate a lost way, a kind of hybrid culture where the Mongols were sort of the dominant part. The Chinese were the ones who had to kind of conform themselves to Mongols, but they did so, and they created this thing which was today is a no longer existing culture, but it's I think it is interesting, and I think it also says something very important about how the Mongol Empire actually functioned.
Thank you, Chris. This is an amazing talk, and I'm really excited to read the book. But I'm curious about specifically the section you're talking about with relation to the usage of the title Wang, like king,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm curious, like when you highlight specific things like the Jin Dynasty, what you call the West, whether it's Karakitai, whatever it might be, and then the Song. What are the types of titles that are used to refer to the leadership of the, I guess you're saying, somewhat like legitimate rulers that are being conquered? As
Right.
opposed to
Okay.
long,
So
smaller groups.
yeah. So the now, like for example, Ongkan. This is one of the other interesting kind of. This is another one where, for example, Igor Drakowiltz has a rather different viewpoint on this. One of the interesting things in the campaigns of Chinggis Khan is that Ongkan and the Naman, Taiyan Khan, and so on, these guys in Chinese are called Ke Han, which is Mongolian for Han with two A's, the long A, not the short Han. And I think that that's actually quite important. That seems to be, I mean, a title that is in some sense, that's the imperial title of this work. Also, Ju, ruler, and in some things with some of these we're actually able to reconstruct the Mongolian. And one of the things you'll notice also if you ever go download the open access version of it, you'll notice that in the notes I put a lot of notes of the translation. I put a lot of attention on trying to define what the Mongolian of this might have been, say compare it with the secret history and so on. So yeah, it seems to be Kahan was in some sense kind of the distinctive title, and Wang was therefore was the sovereign title. A Wang was a kind of a local ruler, not really one. On the other hand, though, it's very interesting. Wang, because in Chinese, Wang also has a sense of like the abstract, a monarch, any monarch. And interesting enough, in Middle Mongolian, the Han with a short A, just Han with one A, not two that is used in Middle Mongolian in an abstract form. Like so, you see this in the Secret History of the Mongols. So like where Chinggis Khan says, someone who has betrayed his own Ka, the Ka without the N. That's kind of an indefinite version of it. What we find in Middle Mongolian. So that's the word, betrays their own ruler. So it's kind of an interesting. It's a kind of an interesting dynamic in which Wang, on the one hand, is like a subordinate ruler, but it's also the idea of monarchy in the abstract. But Kahan seems to be the one that, or Han, really, what would be the Mongolian original. Han appears to be the most commonly used sovereign title, and that's used for Ong Khan and Naman Khan. But the Keriot, the Taichot, they're never Kahans. So they're never Khans.
Is that the same for like the Jin? Or is the Jin like a Ju?
Yes, yeah. And so the Jin show up as Jinju, but probably the Mongolian original for most of it was probably, and it shows up once twice as Altan Khan with a long A. So because he also was again the North China was one of the seats of the empire. So one was Mongolia, one was North China, and only by conquering all of them could Mongolia have this truly world empire.
And thank you, Chris. Amazing, beautiful presentation for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.